Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. Our 10th festival, like thousands of other events, was no longer able to proceed due to the rapidly evolving situation around COVID-19. While our 10th anniversary is postponed, we have 9 years of stimulating dangerous ideas in the archive to ponder, reminding us of the eerily relevant conversations that take place at the festival each year. One of the ways to be unforgettable is to be unforgivable. Manne quotes psychoanalyst Adam Phillips at the beginning of this Festival of Dangerous Ideas talk from 2014. In this session, writer and social commentator Manne breaks down the spectrums and causes of narcissism in our current culture and questions whether we can turn society back towards values of altruism and generosity. This is Manne with her festival presentation on the narcissism epidemic.
I want to begin with the Norwegian killer, the mass killer Anders Breivik, who, when he'd finished his killing spree in the island of Utøya, had killed 77 people, 69 of them young people who'd gathered for a kind of Labour Party leftist camp. And when he was arrested, he was surrounded by all these corpses, and the policeman came up to him and he held up a finger. And on the finger, there was a small cut, and he really wanted a Band-Aid. And the policeman said later he couldn't believe it. He was so intent, he said, on getting that Band-Aid. Later, other facts came to light about Breivik. Just before his crime, he'd posted a 1,500-word manifesto on the internet, which was a far-right kind of rant of anti-Islamic, anti-feminist and anti-left-wing ideas. He'd also posted photos of himself in a tight wetsuit to give better muscle definition, because he was a self-confessed gym junkie and had been using steroids for muscle definition. And his appearance, you might say, meant a lot to him. He'd had plastic surgery to remove a Nordic nose, a less than perfect nose in his eyes, and to give him a perfectly cleft chin. In fact, this young man was all but invisible in Norwegian society. He hadn't been able to establish any successful long-term relationships. He hadn't been able to make a career for himself. He'd returned home to live with his mother. So deep down, he felt an absolute failure. Now, as the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips says, one way to be unforgettable is to be unforgivable. And that was Breivik's path. In court, he described his crime as spectacular, and note how he's embedding the spectators in the way he describes it. And he was completely indifferent throughout the trial to the horrendous description of the injuries that he had inflicted, while the families had to sit and listen to what had happened to their loved ones. But there was one particular moment where he began to tremble with emotion, and then tears ran down his cheeks. And that was when they played him speaking to part of his manifesto. That is, he was weeping at the sound of his own voice. He was diagnosed with an extreme narcissistic personality disorder. Things like schizophrenia were dismissed because he was not psychotic. And most people with schizophrenia are not actually violent. Once he was in prison, he began to find all sorts of sources of grievance. The version of PlayStation, as a video game, was too old. And he felt that his coffee was served too cold. So right the way through, you can see this extraordinary self-focus. Now, Anders Breivik is an absolute extreme, but sometimes when we look at an extreme, it's a bit like seeing the scaffolding of a building, its architecture outlined against a well-lit sky. So narcissism is on a spectrum. And if he's the malignant narcissist at one end, we've then got right the way through to the people who behave in simply obnoxious ways at home and at work. And we have quite subclinical, very mild versions in people who function very well in society, but are nonetheless extremely unpleasant as bosses, are the philandering husband or philandering wife, and so on. But I want to emphasise that it's not just, all the jokes about selfies aside, something that is to do with just being selfish or vain. It's actually a whole package, a whole syndrome, and it's an architecture of mind, you might say, like that image of the building. There's a whole architecture of mind, a whole syndrome, where the self is unstable. It has very high self-esteem, but it's not really secure. So it's as if this self is being constructed all the time on quicksand. So everything in that narcissist's life is conscripted into bolstering this grandiose but unstable and fragile self. And the pursuit of attention is essential to them. It's a bit like an addiction, where the hit of pride keeps them afloat. How is it identified? One of the standard measures for the more pathological form of narcissistic personality disorder, and this is, in therapy territory, highlights such things as grandiosity, feeling special, more special than anybody else, and a sense of being grandiose without really commensurate achievements, so that this is not a person who actually has achieved a lot and is simply proud of it. A sense of entitlement is crucial, that they are more deserving than other people. And a willingness to exploit others, and people at the receiving end of the narcissist often describe something like being, like a lemon you've squeezed and then discarded, as the remains. You've been used. This excessive self-focus where whatever is good for the self is good, when in reality, of course, there is always a struggle between the balance of self and other. Most crucially, the lack of empathy. Summed up, I thought, really beautifully in one of the titles of the academic articles I read called "Others Exist for Me," which also became the title of my chapter in my book on sexual narcissism. There's also a real capacity to retaliate when criticised or aggressed against. Most people don't like to be criticised, but at the same time, you won't necessarily retaliate with savagery if you are. But in the lab, in the psych lab, they've found that someone higher in narcissism will be prepared to give others an aversive blast, a very loud noise if they're criticised, or even an electric shock. Their lives are based on themselves always being in the right. It's a bit like that old line from the 70s movie Love Story, "You never have to say you're sorry." One of the other tests is the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, and is used to assess the much milder subclinical forms of narcissism. And it has all these items which, when you read them cold, as I first did when I was researching the book, I found quite hilarious. Like, you have to choose between the thought of ruling the world frightens the hell out of me. Well, that's okay, I agree with that. But how about this? Versus, if I ruled the world, it would be a much better place. I found it really hard to believe that anyone would tick that box, but apparently they do. I mean, Nelson Mandela, Obama, there's a lot of able people out there. I really don't think, if I took over, Gaza would be in much better shape. But another is, I am much like everybody else, or I am an extraordinary person. And I think we know how Breivik might have answered that one. Now, here's the thing. Narcissism has been around as long as the Greek myth of Narcissus, who used to gaze into the lily pond, and he loved himself so much he could not tear his gaze away from himself. And the myth goes he finally pined away, he starved to death, and he had caused great havoc through his life because he could not love all those who loved him, particularly the nymph Echo. So it's been around a long time. I'm a great lover of literature, present and past, and certainly all through the 18th, 19th century, you will find many wonderful descriptions in Jane Austen, George Eliot, Dostoevsky. You'll find lots of descriptions of Narcissus. But here's the thing. Scholars have been tracking narcissism in American college students, and they've found it rising in each successive generation. It rose 30% from 1979 to 2006. And most importantly, it rose most sharply in the 2000s. Then there was some other work done, which is absolutely fascinating too, that empathy, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, was also declining. And at the same time, a certain sort of insecure, avoidant pattern of attachment to parents associated with lack of empathy and self-enhancement and rather bullying behaviour was on the rise. So all of these developments, I suggest, are interrelated. Here's another troubling study. Harvard did some research recently into the values of young people. And they found to their horror that 80% thought that achievement and being a success in life were the most important things to aim at and to value. But only 20% valued caring for others. Now, there's nothing wrong with valuing achievement, but to have such a disparity between valuing achievement and success and caring for others, I suggest when all of them are going to either have children or they're going to have to care for old parents or care for each other or care for the community is going to be a problem. What the researchers said was, what the hell have we been teaching young people? We can see narcissism in rising rates of plastic surgery around the world, and Australia is no different. We have really significant numbers of people not only having plastic surgery here now, but also going to Thailand and Malaysia every year, where they can have a cheaper kind of makeover. There's a rising incivility, like internet trolling, that led to Charlotte Dawson's suicide. It's a bit higher amongst men usually, but that's not the case among celebrities. And of celebrities, it's highest amongst reality TV stars. So, like Kim Kardashian, I don't know if all of you know, I actually had one of the most fun weeks of my life where I donated. You always have to make a sacrifice for your art, or like doctors have to sometimes inject themselves with an ailment in order to find out whether some sort of vaccine will work. Well, I watched the Kardashians for a full week. And the drama centres essentially on whether Kimmy, as she's called, will take off her clothes. I wonder, will she? So one of them was whether or not she'd do a Playboy shoot with her clothes off. And of course, she's not that sort of a girl. But she did take off her clothes. So she turned out she was that sort of a girl. And then there was her mother, who wanted to get in on the act. So she wanted a nude photo shoot. So then the question was, would she take off her clothes? And she did. Surprise, surprise. And on it goes. And it's always, that's the same kind of thing. So it's a mixture of exhibitionism, and that is, unsurprisingly, the most important aspect of female celebrity stars. Kim is about to bring out a book of selfies. And then, so I'm waiting for that. I'm looking forward to it. I actually became quite fond of them in the end. On the other hand, I had a new sympathy. There's a kind of an enmeshed female presence that, I felt like joining the men's movement afterward, really. Speaking of men, there's her husband, Kanye West. He's a rap singer. A self-described megastar. The word star is not quite enough for Kanye. It's megastar. Now, here's how Kanye West described himself. People get mad at me saying that I'm a creative genius, but it's just obvious. It's like factual. I would write creative genius when I go through the airport. I would put that on customs forms where you put, what your title is, except for 2 reasons. It takes too long to write. And sometimes I spell the word genius wrong. On the other hand, according to Kanye, or at least according to a long, rambling 45-minute speech he made at his wedding, there is an oppressed minority in the world that we have not yet taken full account of, and that is celebrities. They have to cope, just as those struggling for civil rights in the 60s had to cope with fighting to get on a bus and sit next to a white person to enter public spaces. They have to cope with the paparazzi. So all the kind of photos and everything else, which, so you can see, narcissism often goes along with a sense of victimhood. So narcissism really is about a condition where the balance between the self and the other person's all gone wrong. In fact, when they do neuroscientific studies, where you look at scans of the brain, they've even found that the narcissist, when they're resting, whereas for the non-narcissistic person, your mind does not still be awake, as it were, and is still not lit up where it concerns the self. For the narcissist, those parts of the brain are still fully switched on. There are all sorts of aspects about a narcissist that lead to other problems. They're not a great person to fall in love with. There might even be some people here in the audience who've especially come along to this because they've been at the receiving end of a narcissist. They're game players upon whom the rule of who is least interested seems the right way to go, because then you have the most power. And they are much more likely to be unfaithful. They keep their eye out for other alternatives. One of the really leading researchers in the US, Keith Campbell, wrote a book called When You Love a Man Who Loves Himself, but you could just shove the gender around and have When You Love a Woman Who Loves Herself. My favourite example from that was he gave the example of a man who had, have you had the photos of loved ones by your bed? Well, he had a photo of himself. But more seriously, narcissism is implicated in sexual aggression. So when you have that moment, we all know that date rape is actually the most familiar, the most common form of rape. When you have that moment where it's a question of whether you accept or don't accept a refusal, or whether you start to use coercion, it turns out with a lot of quite detailed work, narcissism is really important. As we think about all the scandals we've had with the Australian Defence Force, and we think about the scandals in various football codes, then we need to take seriously the fact that sexual aggressors are shown to have high degrees of narcissism in the way that we raise boys, for example. Let's think now, again, of a reasonably extreme example, but I think it's really interesting, of Elliot Rodger. Many of you may have followed this case. He was the young man who was guilty of killing some young women and some young men in California. And the reason is entirely narcissistic. He hacked to death 3 of his housemates and then, in a drive-by shooting, murdered some young women and another man. In several videos posted online, just like Breivik before his crime, this business of always wanting to be seen and be immortalised in the video that you post just prior to your crime is now becoming ubiquitous. But he's sitting in his BMW, a present given to him by his mother. He points to his $300 Armani sunglasses. He says how his car is better than any of the other boys at college. Then he speaks about being frustrated in still being a virgin and having been rejected by young women. This is what he says. I'm such a magnificent guy and I'm beautiful, civilised, intelligent, sophisticated. Yet every single day I have to be insulted by hot, beautiful, blonde girls walking with stupid, obnoxious douchebags. I deserve them more. In another clip he says, he's perfect and fabulous and yet has been made to feel, and I'm quoting, so invisible as none of the girls pay any attention to me. Such an injustice. Unbelievable, he says. And then he goes out and commits his crimes. Narcissism has also been at the centre of cheating in sport. One of the chapters in my book's on Lance Armstrong, and I found it absolutely fascinating, not only because I'm a complete Tour de France junkie, which I admit, so a lot of fun reading about the race, but the really interesting thing was the way in which narcissism played out in Lance Armstrong's character. One of his teammates, Tyler Hamilton, summed up Lance Armstrong's philosophy as whatever you were doing, those other fuckers are doing more. Now, Lance Armstrong was really one of the great citizen saints of America. He seemed to represent the American dream. He'd overcome testicular cancer. He was a friend of presidents. He was on the red carpet. He dated celebrities. He was worth $100 million. He'd won 7 Tour de France's by the time he was actually exposed as a serial doper, a cheat, a bully, and a quintessential narcissist. He, it turned out, had used friends mercilessly. Wherever he wanted to get to, he used them up and then he'd just discard them and jettison them from the team rather than in any way show loyalty to them. His cancer was actually as a result of steroid misuse. And when he went back to road racing, rather than realise that he had made such a mistake in using steroids, he went back to doping and cheating with a vengeance. And when the tests for performance-enhancing drugs became better, he resorted to blood transfusions. So the team bus for US Postal, that was his team, would be stopped mid-tour, and where all the other riders who were not doping were getting exhausted and were having to ride in an honest way to the truth of their natural ability and endurance, Armstrong was actually lying on the floor of a bus or a floor of a hotel room with a bulging red bag of his own blood, which had been taken out at the peak of his training when he was full of red blood cells, full of oxygen-bearing red blood cells, which is so crucial riding up the mountains. And that would be coursing into his veins, and the rest of the riders in his team, ditto. And so then they would get on their bikes, and he was able to ride up mountains, and people commented later it was amazing, with his mouth closed. He wasn't even panting. But it was to do with this dishonest misuse and manipulation of oxygen in the blood. During that period of Armstrong's dominance, not only did he lead members of his team into doping, he really coerced them into doing so. And Tyler Hamilton has written a whole a book about that. And the speed of the tour actually increased by 20%. If anyone threatened to expose him, he was absolutely ferocious in defending his self-interest and threatened legal action. Of course, if you're confronting someone who has 100 million behind him, he was actually going to buy the Tour de France at one point. But, so he was a very powerful character to reckon with. But narcissism is really a short-term strategy, and sooner or later, usually people see what the narcissist is all about. They begin to have problems, and people expose them. And it was exactly this with Lance Armstrong. And in the end, he ended up having to go on to Oprah, the modern confessional box, and he told the shameful truth about his life. So now we get to the question of what some of the causes might be. Now, how we must be all thinking, certainly I was thinking as I was reading all these examples, how has parenting changed? And that was one of the big, really interesting questions that I focused my book on. And I want to now give you a case of how it might have changed. Consider the father, Jeremiah Heaton. He's from the US, and he went, when his daughter asked him whether she could be a real princess, as opposed to, just wearing a princess costume, he actually said yes. And then he set about making it true. So he consulted Dr. Google, which, as you know, is excellent for hypochondriacs to diagnose rare tropical diseases. But it turns out it's also very useful to find undiscovered countries. He found a bit of unclaimed turf, about 800 square miles of it, between Sudan and Egypt. And on his 7th birthday, he went across and planted a flag, and he claimed it. He proclaimed himself king and his daughter princess of Northern Sudan. As yet, there's been no approval from the United Nations. We're waiting. But Mr. Heaton said he was reaching out to the African Union, and he felt they'd look favourably upon his claim. He said, I wanted to show my kids I would literally go to the ends of the earth to make their wishes and dreams come true. As a parent, you sometimes go down paths that you never thought you would. Or perhaps should. Welcome to the world of the indulgent, omnipotent parent. Now, Sigmund Freud thought that becoming a parent awakened the narcissism in all of us. I'm not as pessimistic as Freud, because I see a lot in parenting that is very different, a decentering from self, overcoming narcissism, as a matter of fact, turning up to netball at 5 a.m. in the morning, getting up at a similar hour to take your children to swimming lessons if they're really keen on swimming, rather than sleeping in and sipping a latte. But nonetheless, as this father shows, there can be a corruption of those good impulses to support your children. There's a lot said about helicopter parenting, and it's hardly surprising that we have books written called Too Much of a Good Thing and the Price of Privilege, or Michael Carr-Gregg recently decrying what he called crappy parenting, the lack of the N-word, meaning the lack of the word no. But I have to say that I don't agree with the simple notion, having done a heck of a lot of research for this book, that it's just that kids are spoiled. That rise in insecure attachments I mentioned earlier have long been known to be associated with parents who don't really tune into the child when the child has needs. And a lot of the really interesting work about helicopter parenting and narcissism shows they're actually tuning in at the moments when the child is going to be high achieving. So this is a child who has to be a star, who has to be at the top of the class, who has to be the star of the sports team. And they're coming along perhaps to the sports day, but not actually supporting the child necessarily at all the more difficult moments and more failed moments perhaps of the child's life. This is a child who gets too much of what they don't need, like material possessions and all this emphasis on achievement, and too little of what they do need, which is the kind of parenting which builds character, sets limits and has an ethical framework of values to live by, and encourages children to be self-critical, to be self-reflective, and have self-respect rather than this holy grail of parenting that we've been sold for so many years, which is high self-esteem, which actually turns out to be the essence of narcissism. So just giving your child high self-esteem, a caution is that many of those who are incarcerated criminals have actually very high self-esteem. Low self-esteem isn't great, but there are, as with all things, there is a balance. But it's not just parenting, because parents don't exist in a vacuum. In fact, they are responding to a much wider culture. Here I like Christopher Lashes, who wrote the first really interesting book called The Culture of Narcissism back in several decades ago. And he said that the prevailing culture brings out the narcissism in all of us, and I think that's right, whether it's the social media, whether it's celebrity culture. The desire for fame, for example, is much greater amongst young people, but amongst everybody than it was. Society is really changing. And the two underlying seismic shifts that we really need to pay attention to, according to, we're really looking at the hard evidence, is a kind of selfish individualism and a hyper-competitive capitalism. It's more significant, it's higher in societies which have the most competitive forms of capitalism and what we call neoliberalism, or a kind of free market system. But it's also this selfish individualism. And I want to here draw attention just to capture that. A very popular best-selling author, I was astonished to learn that something like a third of Americans have all read her. Some of you may have read her, but Ayn Rand. She actually wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, how's that for a title for a narcissist? That's great. She was also very narcissistic in her own life, incidentally. Her biography is fascinating. But in one of her novels, she said this: "I am done with the monster of we. Now I see the face of God, and I raise this God over the earth. This God will grant them joy and peace and pride. This God, this one word, I." So to me, that's an extraordinary statement of this, with the triumph of the self. But she was also a great supporter and propagandist for the prevailing economic system. She once addressed a group of wealthy businessmen in America, amongst the most wealthy, and it was called Sanction of the Victims. And the victims she was talking about were these wealthy businessmen. They were the most oppressed group, she said, in American society. Now, we've had told to us for a long time that a rising tide will float all boats. And under this philosophy, under neoliberalism, it's most true in America, but it's certainly true in Australia too, inequality has grown exponentially. During the 1950s, for example, CEOs earned about 25 to 30 times what the employees did. By the neoliberal era, it was between somewhere about 300 to 500 times as much. And the three richest men in the world were worth as much as the poorest 600 million. So what you might say, does it matter? Well, some really, I think, stunning new work on wealth and inequality and the rise of narcissism by a psychologist called Paul Piff suggests it does matter. In fact, he's blunt enough to call it the asshole effect. He's American. We'd call it the arsehole effect. So what's the arsehole effect? This is now, we're a long way away from Anders Breivik. We're a long way away from Lance Armstrong. This is not the pathological end of narcissism. This is the mild, subclinical, the everyday form. People are functioning perfectly well, but they're assholes. As we ponder Joe Hockey's budget, it's you clapping, I didn't say it. And his division of the world into lifters and leaners, as we learn from Oxfam that the richest 1% of Australians now own the same wealth as the bottom 60%, we ought to think about this guy, Paul Piff, and his studies. What he found was as they grow wealthier, they are more likely to feel entitled, to become meaner, more likely to exploit others, and even to cheat. He had a lot of really interesting experiments. One of them was really simple. He just had researchers at crossroads and at pedestrian crossings, and he worked out which vehicles didn't give way. High status vehicles, he found, the later the model and the flash of the car, you know, the Mercedes, the big four-wheel drive, were 4 times more likely to cut off drivers sputtering along in an old bomb. Now, as a driver who has mainly been in old bombs, I found this research very satisfying. Be careful when you go to the zebra crossing. Look carefully, left and right, not just for a car, but what make and model, because you are 3 times more likely to be mowed down by an expensive later model car. Here's the interesting thing. People in old bombs, least expensive sort of cars, always stopped. So, interesting. So he went on. In the laboratory, the richest students were more likely to consider stealing and benefiting from things to which they were not entitled than those from a middle class or lower class background. Even people just primed to feel rich with various, signals in the laboratory were more likely to put their fat little hand in a sweets jar, which was designed for the children in the lab next door, than children who were not so primed, or people who were primed, to feel disadvantaged. So he was looking at it and he said, okay, so the key issue seems to be a sense of entitlement. When you become wealthy, even creating ideas of being wealthy can create feelings of increased entitlement. So how long does it take? Here's the thing, as long as a game of Monopoly. One of the little fascinating experiments he did was to have on camera 2 people playing Monopoly. He gave one person, let's call him Joe, $2,000 to begin with and $200 every time he passed go. The other guy, let's call him Jeff, gets $100 when he passes go and $1,000 to begin with. So it's stacked right from the beginning. Now, Joe gets a Rolls Royce as a token, and he can roll 2 dice at once, while poor old Jeff gets 1 roll. Jeff gets a humble little elf shoe too, whereas Joe gets, this really flash-looking Rolls Royce. So having created these conditions of advantage, they think feelings of entitlement and superiority may well show up. And indeed it does. Joe starts to smirk. This is the reflecting dominant behaviour amongst primates, if you've ever seen any of that research. His posture balloons. He takes up more space. He begins smacking his piece down really hard. He then grabs poor old Jeff's token and moves it for him. By the end of the game, he's kind of ruthless and he's just, in there for the kill. The reporter who wrote all this up for New York Magazine was just stunned by seeing just how quickly an ordinary person, because in this case, Joe with the Rolls-Royce token is not a really wealthy person in real life, but just how quickly it can have the effect of increasing a sense of entitlement. Now that's just a game, what about the real life? Well, it turns out that in Piff's research, and I've actually checked with some heads of charity here, and they say they find similar things, that in wealthier postcodes they gave less as a proportion of their income than people in poorer postcodes. I heard that from Tim Costello and World Vision, that, for example, that in Frankston they'll give more than in Toorak. I know you're in Sydney, but you'd have an equivalent of a poorer suburb versus somewhere in the North Shore. Wealthy people too, when they were told they'd have a photograph taken, immediately rushed to the mirror to see what they'd look like. People who were not wealthy didn't. Asked to draw symbols like circles, they saw themselves in as a larger circle, and they were less empathetic with people in need, unless, so it shows it's actually not, set in concrete, they were shown an image of someone who was like a child in poverty, someone who was in need. So it was actually able to be manipulated, it was able to be changed. So it raises a question of how we are. I was thinking last year when we were briefly the most wealthy nation in the world because our dollar was very high. We're still amongst one of the most wealthy nations in the world, and I was trying to figure out why it was that we were at the very same moment as this news came out, thinking about cutting foreign aid. So I thought to myself, how is this possible? And I think that this kind of research is telling us why. So as we become wealthier, it becomes possible to think about whether it's asylum seekers or we think about the poor and the vulnerable in a certain kind of way. And indeed, we can have a budget such as we've had, which makes the hardest cuts hit the bottom half as opposed to those who can really pay for it in the upper reaches of society. So wealth cultivates attitudes against redistribution and for privilege, you might say. Of course, we have, if you think about priming in the laboratory wealthy people for having empathy for someone with poverty, a child in poverty, you can think about how we treated people with a disability after we'd had a long campaign by Bill Shorten and others, Rhonda Galbally and many of the disability sector people, Bruce Bonahady, and we actually became much more empathetic to the very real plight of those people with a disability, but also the families caring for them. So I suggest that it's not set in concrete, so it's really worth drawing it out and pointing out what we have. We can either be drawn by our political leaders towards generosity and altruism, instead of being drawn towards selfishness and the hip pocket nerve. Most importantly, I want to raise the question as to whether or not the narcissist is really being produced by our economic system, whether they're really a character for our times, rather than an aberration and caused by social media, which I think is rather a furphy in that it is there, and certainly narcissists will use social media in a very narcissistic way, whether it's Twitter or whether it's Facebook. But in fact, I suggest that's more of a megaphone for existing narcissistic qualities than a cause in and of itself. Rather, I think the really important question is how narcissists are more materialistic, more oriented to achievement and self-enhancement. They are more acquisitive. They've even been shown to be much more oriented to buying brand names than they are to having a more serviceable but no brand item. So in a way, they are really a character who is very suitable for the kind of economy that we have. And I think the problem of narcissism is much larger than just living a because I'm worth it lifestyle. The real problem for me, when I was writing this book, the big looming question over everything I was looking at in the research is it possible that we become so narcissistic that, like Narcissus staring into that lily pond, we will be looking into all the lovely things of the consumer society which reflect us better back at the world and better than we really are, all those self-enhancing things, the large carbon footprint and so on. Will it be that we will become so self-indulgent and enchanted and intoxicated by all we see in this consumer lily pond that we are not prepared to face and to do something about the really looming disaster of climate change? So that's my question. In the face of that impending tragedy, can we actually turn this society of the selfie around, where narcissism is rampant, and turn it back towards values of altruism, generosity, care for each other, and care for the planet that we share?
This session was recorded live at the Sydney Opera House and presented by the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website.